Welcome back. We're going to start a study of plate tectonics today. And plate tectonics is a very interesting idea, and it was rejected for ages. It's the idea that the crusts and the oceans and the continents are actually on a cracked surface where the rock is actually floating in a denser molten material that gives it the energy to actually move. So the flowing convection currents of heated rocks that are all molten and semi-molten under the continents are actually giving energy to allow these continents to slide together. So we're going to do this over a few lessons to look at this idea. So today we're just going to look at the history of how the idea developed and the guys who are responsible for the ideas. The continent going on is actually on a big cruise around the whole world, and that these continents are bumping into each other because it doesn't look like anything is moving, but there is evidence for it, and even people a long time ago were starting to see the possibility that there once was a joining of continents. As map makers started sending ships out all over the world during the end of the Renaissance, so 1500s, you did have maps good enough to where if you simply looked at a world map, you could kind of say, hey, it may look like Africa could fit in between North America and South America, almost like pieces of a puzzle that could fit together. What's about that? So this is a fellow who wrote in his diary in the 1500s, this man named Ortelius, who was the first to basically say, hey, I wonder if it was possible that these actually had been at one time together. The big proponent, the guy who made it his life's work to try to convince people that the continents were actually moving, was a American guy named Alfred Wengerner, and he didn't do a really great job of convincing, though he did some excellent science. He was able to, from many different aspects, show that there was evidence that continents at one time belonged to the same landmass. So his proposal was that the continents were actually drifting, somehow floating. Now, how do you float an island? How do you float something as big as North America? That's why that he was laughed at, and he was really not even taken seriously by the major scientists of the early 20th century. But of course, after he died, everyone realized, hey, this actually does make some sense, because there are some mechanisms that would make continents be able to float around, and we'll talk about those later. So the first big idea that you would have had a super landmass where all of the continents would have fit together was named Pangaea. So it's almost like a supercontinent or a one huge continent. Now, you would have to, if you were to move all of these around so that they would fit nice inside of each other, lots of things would have happened. So you would have to change the coastlines a little bit of some of the continents, knowing that land would have broken apart from each other and then sealed back up together, but pretty much keeping their shape. You would also have to realize that some of these continents would have had to travel a long way in order to get to where we now know they are. So it was a tall order for Wengerner to suggest all of this. So he had to look at a lot of different types of evidence. The first evidence that he looked at was obvious. If you're going to crack an egg, not just the shape of the crack has to be the same on both sides, but the material on both sides needs to be the same. So if you are going to break rocks apart and then continents break apart and then slide apart from each other, it would suggest that the edges of those should contain the same rock material. And so he was able to show that the coastlines of various continents does have the same geology, the same rock strata, etc. So it wasn't completely out of the question, but people were still scratching their head because how does a continent move? That was always the question they came back to. Okay, so you've suggested that the rocks on North America East Coast and Africa Northwest Coast are the same, and the shapes do look like that they would fit, but is that enough? Is that enough of a proof that this happens when we don't know how that it could work? He also looked at fossils. So the fossils in the rocks in places that would have been contiguous or connected should be in those cases. So if you were to have an extinct animal that is found in 2 or 3 different continents but yet at one time would have been actually linked, it would have made sense that is an evidence that there was a linkage, because putting them in such disjointed places is actually harder to believe than if they were in one place and simply died over an extended area. Also, in terms of climate, if you were to have certain fossils of, say, plants that you know are tropical plants, but they're growing in Antarctica, okay, so either the climate of Antarctica has changed or the Antarctica's location has changed, or both. And so he did show that there was evidence in the fossil record of warm, wet regions that would have been in different places that certainly are not the case now. You're also going to have coal. So coal, remember, is living, usually plants and animals that have died very quickly and were covered very quickly. And if you were to connect all of the continents together with a ribbon of the coal deposits, it does line up with this supercontinent Pangaea idea. Also going to have evidence in terms of glaciers. If you have glacier activity in Antarctica, nobody really seems to mind because that makes sense. But if you have glacial activity in southern South America, where there were no glaciers coming down into South America, from where? From the open ocean, would have been hard to see, and so you would have seen that in the middle of sub-Saharan Africa, to have glacier scraping does make people puzzle. And so that is an evidence that at one time this area of Africa would have been in a very cold area, even though it's of course not now. So people liked his ideas and they were wonderful to talk about, but the big problem is, how do you move a continent? So until there was a proposal of a mechanism of how you could move something as heavy and big as Asia, then nobody was going to listen to him. And it wasn't until later to where people did see that there was evidence of a mechanism that could have been proposed that would answer these facts of how is it possible that something as heavy as a continent could slide around.